A single act of kindness in a quiet restaurant changed the life of a struggling waitress and gave a disabled boy the smile he had been missing. The billionaire sat quietly at the long window of his study, staring out at the city lights that sparkled against the night sky. The view was beautiful, but it did nothing for him. To the world, he had everything: tall buildings with his name on them, private jets waiting at the airport, cars lined up in his garage, and an army of people working day and night for him. But inside, he carried a weight that not even the largest fortune could lift. His son, the only thing that truly mattered to him, was a boy who never got the chance to live like other children. The boy was gentle, with big eyes that often stayed fixed on the smallest details around him. His disability had taken away the things most people took for granted. He couldn't run, he couldn't play ball with other kids, and sometimes even simple tasks were impossible without help. The father spent money on the best doctors in the world, hoping that maybe, just maybe, one of them would say something different, something hopeful. But every time he left those appointments, all he carried with him was the silence of unanswered prayers. Still, the boy was his life. The father rearranged his entire world to make sure his son was comfortable. Expensive therapists came to their mansion, nurses stayed by his side. Specially designed toys, custom-built wheelchairs, everything was provided. Yet happiness, that simple spark of joy, was something that seemed out of reach for the boy. And the father noticed it every single day, cutting into his heart deeper than any loss of money ever could. That evening, after a long and heavy day, the father made a sudden decision. He told his driver to take them to a quiet place for dinner, somewhere away from the flashing cameras and the endless meetings. He didn't want a fancy restaurant with chandeliers and polished silverware. He just wanted to sit somewhere simple. Somewhere his son might feel normal, even if it was just for a moment. The car pulled up in front of a small family restaurant, the kind with a hand-painted sign and warm lights glowing through the windows. The billionaire helped his son out of the car, carefully guiding his wheelchair through the doorway. A few people in the restaurant looked up as they entered, recognizing him instantly. Some whispered, some stared at the boy. He was used to it by now. So was his father. But he hated the way people's eyes carried pity, like they were looking at someone broken. He wished they could just see his son as a child, not a condition. A hostess quickly led them to a booth in the corner. The father adjusted the boy's blanket and placed a toy in his lap, one of his favorites. He tried to smile at his son, but the boy's expression was distant. He wasn't in pain, but he wasn't happy either. It was that quiet emptiness again. And the father felt helpless. The waitress arrived with a polite smile, holding a notepad in one hand. She was young, probably in her 20s, her uniform slightly wrinkled from a long shift. The billionaire had seen that look before, tired, eyes trying to hide behind a smile. She greeted them kindly, speaking to both the father and the boy. Most people usually skipped over the child, acting as if he wasn't there. But she bent down slightly, meeting the boy's eyes as she asked what he might like to drink. Even though she must have known he couldn't answer in words, the father ordered for both of them, his voice calm but tired. The waitress nodded and left, and the father leaned back in his seat, glancing at his son. The boy's eyes were watery now. The father noticed it immediately, those quiet tears that showed up without warning. He reached for a napkin, but his hands froze halfway. He didn't want to draw attention to it in public, to make his son feel like a spectacle. He lowered his hands slowly, his chest tight, not knowing what to do. When the waitress returned with the drinks, she noticed it instantly. She didn't hesitate, didn't look awkward like most people did. She set the glasses down gently, and then, crouched beside the boy, the softest voice, she asked, "Hey, are you okay, sweetheart?" The boy blinked and one tear slid down his cheek. Without asking permission, she reached for a napkin, her movements gentle and respectful. She wiped the tear from his face, as if she had done it 1,000 times for someone she loved. She didn't rush. She didn't stare. She didn't make it uncomfortable. Her hand was steady, and her smile was real. The billionaire watched silently, frozen in his seat. No one had ever done that before. People usually looked away, afraid to step too close, or they treated his son like a fragile object. But this waitress, this stranger in a small-town restaurant, was different. She looked at his boy like he was simply a child who needed comfort. Nothing more, nothing less. The boy's lips curved into the smallest smile, barely there, but the father noticed it. His son's eyes softened, and for the first time in weeks, maybe months, he seemed at ease. The billionaire's throat tightened, and he quickly reached for his glass of water to hide the emotion rising in him. He wasn't used to feeling this way in public, vulnerable and exposed, but something about the moment had shaken him deeply. The waitress continued to talk to the boy as she straightened his napkin and adjusted his straw so he could sip easily. She didn't ask the father about his business, didn't mention his wealth, didn't even act as though she recognized who he was. All of her attention was on the child, as if nothing else in the world mattered in that moment. When she finally walked away to tend to another table, the father leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. He looked at his son again. Boy's eyes were brighter now, his fingers curled around his toy with more interest. The billionaire couldn't remember the last time a stranger had made such a difference in his son's mood. For the rest of the meal, the father remained quiet, lost in his thoughts. He watched as the waitress moved around the restaurant, serving other customers, smiling despite her obvious exhaustion. Every time she passed by, she checked on his son with a small nod or a word of encouragement. The boy responded each time, his eyes following her, his lips curving into another small smile. The billionaire realized something that night. In all his wealth, in all the years he had fought to give his son the best life possible, happiness had never come from the things money could buy. It came from moments like this, pure, human kindness from someone who cared enough to see his boy, not just his condition. And as he sat there, quietly watching his son's small smile return, he felt something stir inside him that he hadn't felt in a very long time: hope. The restaurant was buzzing softly with conversations and the clinking of cutlery, but at the little corner booth, time felt slower, almost tender. The billionaire's son sat quietly with his toy in his hand, and his eyes kept glancing toward the young woman who had treated him with such care. The father noticed every small detail. His boy, who usually avoided looking at strangers, seemed calmer, almost curious about the waitress. The waitress herself was moving swiftly across the room, balancing plates and glasses, her hair tied back loosely with a strand slipping against her cheek. Her uniform looked a little worn, and her sneakers squeaked faintly against the floor with each hurried step. It was obvious she had been working for hours. But there was something gentle in her manner, a softness that came through no matter how busy she was. She returned to their table with a tray, carefully setting down the plates. She spoke to the father briefly, telling him about the specials of the night. But her attention drifted back to the boy almost immediately. She crouched down again, so she was at his level, as if he deserved more than someone towering over him. With a warm smile, she asked, "Do you like fries? They're really good here." The boy's eyes flickered with a hint of amusement. He didn't answer with words, but his small smile was enough. She placed a little plate of fries in front of him, even though it hadn't been ordered. "On the house," she whispered playfully. "But don't tell my boss." She winked, and for the first time, the boy gave a small laugh. It was soft, almost a breath more than a sound. But it was enough to make the father's heart tighten. The billionaire sat back, astonished. He had hired experts, therapists, and entertainers for his son, all paid heavily to bring him joy. Yet here, a simple waitress with tired eyes had managed to coax laughter out of him in just a few minutes. The woman didn't linger long. She stood up and hurried off to attend to another table, but the moment she left, the father's gaze followed her. Something about her felt different. She didn't act like the rest of the world, who either looked away in discomfort or exaggerated their kindness as if it were charity. No, this was natural, effortless, genuine. A little while later, when she came to refill their drinks, the father decided to speak. "You're very kind," he said softly, his voice steady but filled with meaning. She smiled politely, almost brushing off the compliment. "He's a sweet kid," she replied, glancing at the boy. "Sometimes kids just need someone to notice them." Her words hung in the air longer than she probably intended. To her, it was a simple statement, but to the father, it pierced deeply. Most people noticed his wealth, his power, his influence. But his son? People barely looked twice, and when they did, it was usually pity. This waitress, however, had said something no one else had, that his son deserved to be noticed. The boy reached for a fry, and the waitress watched him for a second, making sure he could manage. When he struggled to grip it properly, she gently helped him without making it obvious, careful not to embarrass him. The father noticed how skillful she was at offering help without taking away the boy's independence. It was something he himself often wrestled with, wanting to protect, but also wanting his son to feel capable. As she walked away again, the father found himself wondering about her. Who was she? What kind of life did she have outside this restaurant? Her eyes had a tired look, not just from the shift, but from something deeper, as if life had been heavy on her shoulders for a long time. Across the room, another waitress whispered something to her, and they both laughed for a moment. The sound was brief, but it carried a hint of relief, as if laughter was rare for her. The billionaire, who had built his empire by reading people and sensing hidden truths, realized quickly that she wasn't just tired from the night's work, she was tired from life itself. Soon she returned again, checking in with a genuine smile. "Is everything good? Do you need anything else?" she asked. The father shook his head politely, but his son looked up at her, eyes wide as though waiting for her to stay a little longer. She noticed, and instead of rushing off, she knelt again. "Want to see a trick?" she asked the boy. She took a straw wrapper, rolled it tightly, and with a flick of her finger made it hop across the table. The boy giggled again, covering his mouth with his small hand. The billionaire couldn't help but smile, though his chest ached at the sight. He hadn't seen his son giggle like that in ages. For the next few minutes, she lingered there talking softly with the boy, even though she had other tables waiting. To her, this wasn't lost time. It was important. Eventually, she stood again and excused herself, promising to come back soon. The father's eyes followed her until she disappeared behind the kitchen doors. He took a slow breath, thinking about what he had just witnessed. He wondered if she knew how extraordinary her small actions were. To her, it might just be kindness. To him, it was life-altering. When she returned with dessert menus, she hesitated. Before speaking, "He reminds me of my little brother," she said softly. "He had some health problems when we were kids. People didn't treat him kindly. I guess that's why I always notice." The father listened, silently absorbing her words. Didn't say more. She didn't talk about herself or her struggles, but in that one sentence, he could hear an entire story hidden behind her voice. There was experience, loss, love, and resilience wrapped in those few words. He wanted to ask her more, but she quickly excused herself as another customer called. Still, the thought stayed with him. She wasn't just kind out of duty, she was kind because she understood. The boy's eyes followed her every time. She moved past their table. Each time she smiled at him, his shoulders relaxed a little more, and his tiny expressions grew brighter. The father couldn't stop watching this bond unfold before him. A stranger had reached into his son's world, a world usually locked away from others, and managed to bring him out even for a short while. The father leaned back in the booth, his mind racing. He had lived in a world where everything could be bought: services, comfort, even false smiles from people eager to please him. But this moment, what he was witnessing now, was something money couldn't touch. It was pure human connection. As the meal neared its end, the waitress returned to clear the plates. She thanked them for coming, and before she left, she bent down once more, brushing her hand lightly against the boy's shoulder. "You're really brave," she whispered to him. The boy beamed at her, his smile wide this time, and the father felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. As they prepared to leave, the billionaire slipped a generous tip into the check folder. But as he glanced at the waitress, who was busy wiping down another table with the same determination, he knew money would never be enough to repay what she had given them in those short moments. For the father, it was a dinner like no other. For the boy, it was an evening of laughter. And for the waitress, It was just another shift. But deep down, the father knew that this night was the beginning of something far bigger than any of them yet understood. The night air outside the restaurant was cool, carrying the faint smell of rain on the streets. The billionaire helped his son into the car, adjusting his blanket carefully. As the driver pulled away, the father glanced back through the window. At the little restaurant fading into the distance, he felt an odd tug in his chest, one that he could not easily explain. His son, usually silent and withdrawn after outings, now sat with a calm expression, his head resting lightly against the seat. Still clutching the toy and the memory of laughter the waitress had given him, that small smile lingered on his face, and it stayed with the father long after they reached home. Over the next few days, he found himself thinking about that evening more than he expected. Meetings came and went, phone calls buzzed nonstop, contracts were signed, and people addressed him with the same tone of respect mixed with fear. But every time he sat alone in his office, his mind returned to the image of the waitress kneeling beside his son, wiping away his tears with such natural care. He remembered her tired eyes and her quiet words. Sometimes kids just need someone to notice them. It was strange for him to be this affected. He had been around countless people in his life, powerful leaders, skilled doctors, celebrities, and professionals who charged thousands of dollars an hour for their expertise. Yet none of them had given his son the simple gift of being seen the way that young woman had. One afternoon, he decided to take his son back to the same restaurant. He told his staff he didn't want a driver that night. Instead, he drove the car himself, preferring the quiet and privacy of being alone with his boy. The boy seemed to recognize where they were going. His eyes widened slightly as they pulled up in front of the familiar sign. And when they entered the restaurant, he immediately looked around for the waitress. She was there, carrying a tray with 3 steaming plates of food to another table. Her hair was tied back the same way, and her uniform looked the same, though a little more faded at the collar. She noticed them, and her face lit up in recognition. "You're back," she said cheerfully, hurrying over. She knelt beside the boy again, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. "Did you miss me?" The boy gave a faint smile, and the father watched with quiet amazement. As she brought menus, the father decided to strike up a conversation. "You seem to really like working with kids," he remarked. The waitress gave a small shrug. "I do. I guess I always have." She glanced at the boy again before standing up. "Kids are honest. They don't care who you are or what you have. They just want you to see them." The billionaire sat silently for a moment, considering her words. She had no idea who he was, no idea about the empire he controlled or the headlines his name appeared in. To her, he was just a man with his son. That, in itself, felt strangely refreshing. When she returned with their food, she stayed a little longer, asking gentle questions about the boy, what he liked to do, what foods he enjoyed. The father was surprised at how she didn't flinch. When his answers revealed the boy's limitations, she didn't give him the sympathetic look he had grown used to, the one that said, "I feel sorry for you." Instead, she nodded as if it was perfectly fine, perfectly normal, and continued speaking to the boy as though nothing was unusual at all. The boy, who often shut down around strangers, seemed comfortable with her. His eyes followed her every movement, and once, when she leaned closer, he reached out slightly, brushing his fingers against her sleeve. The father noticed the way her expression softened when that happened, as though she felt honored by the tiny gesture. Later, while clearing their plates, the waitress admitted something in a quiet voice. "I work here full-time, but I'm also taking care of my mom. She's sick. The bills are tough, but you just keep going, you know? You do what you have to do." The father didn't respond right away. He studied her carefully, seeing past the smile she tried to maintain. There it was, the reason for her tired eyes, the weight she carried behind her cheerful tone. She was struggling. Life was hard for her, yet she still found room to treat his son with more kindness than most people ever had. He felt a pang of something unfamiliar. He was a man who had always solved problems with money. For him, bills were numbers on a screen, debts were transactions to erase with a single phone call. Yet here was a young woman balancing trays, worrying about her sick mother, and still giving kindness freely without asking for anything in return. When they finished dinner, the father left another generous tip, more than she probably made in a week. She thanked him, but he could see in her eyes that she hadn't expected it. To her, kindness was never a transaction. It was simply who she was. That night on the drive home, his son leaned against him in the back seat, unusually peaceful. The father stroked his hair gently, but his thoughts were restless. He couldn't shake the feeling that their lives had brushed against someone important, someone who mattered in ways he didn't yet understand. Over the next week, the billionaire returned to the restaurant several more times. Each visit, he watched closely, not just how she interacted with his son, but how she treated everyone. He noticed how she smiled at the older couple who came in every Friday, how she gave extra napkins to the messy group of children sitting in the corner, how she patiently listened to the lonely man at the bar who seemed to talk too much. She didn't treat these moments as burdens. She treated them as if each person deserved her full attention. The boy grew more attached with every visit. He waited eagerly for her to approach, his small face lighting up the moment she appeared. She, in turn, gave him small games to play. At the table, folded napkins into shapes, or told him silly jokes while refilling their drinks. The connection between them was undeniable, and the father felt both joy and sorrow at the sight. Sorrow because he wondered how fleeting this connection might be in a world that was always pulling people apart. One evening, after their meal, the father decided to ask more about her life. "Do you ever get time for yourself?" he asked gently. As she cleared their plates, she gave a little laugh, but it sounded weary. "Not really. Between work and taking care of Mom, there isn't much left for me, but that's okay. She took care of me my whole life. It's my turn." The billionaire's chest tightened at her words. He thought of all the times he had relied on others to help with his son, how he had nurses and caretakers at his command. Yet here was a young woman carrying her burden almost alone, with only her determination and heart to guide her. That night, as he put his son to bed, the billionaire sat in the dark for a long time. His son was sleeping peacefully, but the father's mind was wide awake. The waitress had unknowingly given him something priceless. She had shown him that kindness did not need wealth to exist, that dignity could be given with a simple gesture, and that love could exist in the most unexpected places. He thought about her words. Again, sometimes kids just need someone to notice them. She had noticed his son when the world chose to look away. And now he found himself noticing her in a way he hadn't expected. Not out of attraction, but out of respect, and something deeper in awareness that perhaps she was meant to be part of their story, more than just a kind stranger in a restaurant. As he lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, the billionaire felt a decision forming quietly in his heart. A decision that would not just change her life, but his son's life, too. Something had begun in that small restaurant, and he knew it was only the beginning. The night was still when the billionaire sat alone in his study, the glow from the city lights stretching across the tall glass windows. His son was already asleep in his room, breathing softly with the comfort of his favorite toy beside him. But the father could not sleep. His mind kept circling back to the waitress, the young woman who had shown more warmth to his son in one evening than many had shown in years. He remembered the way she bent down to his son's level, the way she spoke without pity, the way she treated him as a person rather than a condition. It was a memory that clung to him, no matter how much he tried to push it aside. He thought about all the nights he had sat exactly where he was now, planning business strategies, making decisions that shifted millions of dollars. Those decisions had power. They shaped companies and lives, yet none of them carried the weight of this single thought. How could he repay someone for giving his son back a smile? That was something no amount of wealth could ever truly measure. Next morning, instead of going straight to his office, he stopped by the restaurant again. It was early, just after opening, and the place was still half empty.
Ow.
The waitress was there, tying her apron and wiping down a table. She looked surprised to see him without his son, but she smiled anyway. "Back again?" she asked lightly, nodded, keeping his usual calm expression. "I just wanted to say thank you for the way you treat my boy." Her smile softened. "He's a wonderful kid," she said simply, as though that explained everything. She didn't ask questions about the father's wealth or his expensive suit. She didn't pry into his personal life. She just continued setting up her tables as though he were any other customer. That answer stayed with him. Wonderful kid. Most people saw his son's disability first. She had seen the child beneath it. Later that day, the billionaire made a few quiet phone calls. He asked his assistant to find out more about her, not to invade her privacy, but because something in him needed to know. Within a day, he had answers. She was in her 20s, working full-time at the restaurant. She lived in a small rented apartment not far from the place. Most of her earnings went toward paying for her mother's medical bills. There was no father in the picture, and she had been carrying the weight of responsibility since she was a teenager. Life had not been easy on her, but she never asked for handouts, never begged for pity. She worked day after day and kept going. Reading those details in a file was different from seeing her in person. On paper, her life looked hard, even tragic, yet in person, she carried herself with quiet strength. She smiled when she was exhausted, laughed when she could have cried, and gave her kindness freely, even when the world gave her nothing back. That contrast struck the billionaire deeply. As the week passed, he and his son returned to the restaurant several more times. Each time, the bond between the waitress and the boy grew stronger. She would play small games with him, fold napkins into animals, or tell him funny stories that made his eyes brighten. The father began to notice how his son looked forward to these visits. There was a light in him now, a spark of excitement that hadn't been there in years. It was something the father had tried to buy with toys, therapists, and vacations. But none of those things had worked. Only she had. The billionaire started to watch more closely. He noticed the way she winced slightly when standing up too quickly, probably from exhaustion after long hours. He saw how she sometimes stared at her phone during a quiet moment, her face shadowed with worry before she quickly tucked it away. He noticed how she sometimes took extra shifts, staying late to cover. For others, she never complained, but her body showed the toll. Each night, after leaving the restaurant, the father's mind would spin. He knew he had the power to change her life. One signature on a check, one call to the right person, and her struggles could vanish. But he also knew she wasn't the type to accept help easily. She carried her pride as carefully as she carried her trays. He needed to find a way to help without making her feel small. One evening, as he tucked his son into bed, the boy looked up at him with sleepy eyes and smiled. The father realized it was the same smile the waitress had drawn out of him at the restaurant. He brushed the boy's hair gently and whispered, "You like her, don't you?" The boy didn't speak, but his tiny nod was enough. That was the moment the father's decision settled firmly in his heart. He couldn't ignore this. She was more than a kind waitress. She was someone who had touched their lives in a way no one else had. The following week, father asked one of his trusted staff members to discreetly check into the hospital where her mother was being treated. He learned about overdue bills, about the treatments her mother needed but couldn't afford. His chest tightened as he listened. He had spent millions on things that hardly mattered, on cars, on art, on investments. And here was a young woman, working herself to exhaustion to cover a fraction of hospital bills. That night, he sat in his study again, the papers spread before him. He thought about how easily he could write a check, clear all her debts, and change her life. But he also thought about her dignity, about her quiet strength. He didn't want to make her feel like a charity case. He wanted her to understand that what he was doing wasn't about pity, it was about gratitude, about respect, about recognizing what she had given his son. The decision was made. He would help her, but in a way that allowed her to keep her pride. He would make it look like an opportunity, not a handout. He would create something that honored her kindness and showed her that it had value. The next time he went to the restaurant, he watched her more carefully than ever. She was serving a family with 3 children, balancing plates with ease, even as the kids made a mess of their table. She smiled patiently, laughed at their silly jokes, and never once showed annoyance. Later, she refilled coffee for an older, Man sitting alone listening to him talk for far longer than she needed to. The billionaire realized then that her kindness was not just reserved for his son. It was who she was. She gave pieces of herself to everyone who crossed her path. As he drove home that evening, he glanced at his son in the rearview mirror. The boy was holding a small paper star the waitress had folded for him. His tiny fingers clutched it tightly, his eyes half closed with contentment. The father felt a lump in his throat. That little star, made of nothing but a napkin, had given his son more joy than the expensive toys piled up in their mansion. It wasn't about the object, it was about the love behind it. The billionaire understood now what he had to do. He would honor that love. He would repay it, not with pity, but with something that showed her how deeply she had changed their lives. His plan was already forming, and though he kept it silent, his heart felt lighter, knowing that soon, very soon, he would give back too. The woman who had given his son back his smile that night. For the first time in a long time, the billionaire slept peacefully. The morning sun poured gently through the windows of the small apartment where the waitress lived. She was just waking up, tying her hair back, preparing for another long shift at the restaurant. Bills were stacked neatly on the counter, reminders of the struggle that never seemed to end. She sighed softly, rubbing her eyes, thinking about her mother's treatment and the endless hours of work that lay ahead. Life had been a constant balancing act care for her mother, shifts at the restaurant, and the quiet hope that somehow things would get easier. But today would be unlike any other day. She stepped out into the street, the usual weight of exhaustion pressing down on her shoulders. The restaurant was busy, the smell of fried food and coffee filling the air as she stepped inside. She greeted her co-workers and began her work immediately, serving tables, refilling drinks, and moving with a practiced efficiency born of years of hard work. Yet even amidst the chaos, her mind wandered briefly to the small boy and his father, the ones who had come in several times over the past weeks. She remembered his tiny smiles, the laughter that had brightened his eyes, and the warmth that seemed to radiate from him whenever she was near. It was a simple connection, yet it had left an impression on her heart. One she carried quietly. Later that morning, as she carried a tray of drinks to a corner table, a man approached her. At first she thought he was another customer, but the sharp lines of his suit and the calm confidence in his presence told her otherwise. He held out a hand, politely. "Excuse me," he said softly. "I need to speak with you." She nodded hesitantly, wiping her hands on her apron. He gestured toward a quiet corner of the restaurant, and she followed, curiosity mixed with caution. As soon as they were seated, he spoke. "I'm the father of the little boy you've been spending time with," he began, his voice calm, measured. "I've been watching the way you've treated him, what you did. It wasn't required. Most people look away. But you noticed him. You made him feel seen, made him feel special. It matters more than you can imagine." Her eyes widened slightly and she shook her head. I wanted him to be happy," she said softly, almost embarrassed by the attention. "He's a sweet boy. Anyone would do the same if they could." He smiled, but there was something serious in his gaze. "Not everyone does. And not everyone has the patience, the kindness, or the heart that you've shown. I want you to understand something what you've done for him. For my son. It's changed more than just his day. It's changed his life, and it's touched me more than I can say." She blinked, unsure of what to say. The father continued. "I've seen your life, your struggles, the way you care for your mother, the way you work tirelessly without complaining. I know it hasn't been easy, and I want to help you. Not because you need pity, but because I want to honor the person you are. You deserve this, and I insist you accept it." Her mouth opened, then closed again, the words failing her. She didn't understand at first. The father reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder. Inside were documents, neatly prepared, showing that all of her mother's medical bills would be fully paid, past and future. Additionally, she had been offered a scholarship to complete a course she had always wanted, and a plan to move into a new apartment, fully furnished and comfortable. Everything that had burdened her for years was now lifted in one moment. Tears welled up in her eyes. She shook her head, barely able to breathe. I can't. I don't deserve this." she whispered. The father shook his head gently. You do? You deserve this, and more. You've given my son something far greater than anything money can buy. You've given him joy, dignity, and hope. That's why I'm doing this. It's not as charity, but as gratitude. You've shown a light that money cannot replace. And now, I hope this will give you the freedom to live your life without constant worry. She sat back, stunned, as he laid out the details. The hospital bills would be cleared immediately. The scholarship began the next month, and the apartment keys were ready for her at any time she wished. It was a new beginning, a life she had dreamed of but never thought possible. Overwhelmed, she finally found her voice. I don't know what to say. I never expected anything like this. I was just trying to do the right thing. The father smiled warmly. That's exactly why this is happening. Your kindness was never calculated, never forced. Was genuine, and that's what makes it so rare, so valuable. You've changed our lives. Now, I hope we can change yours in return. For a long moment, she sat in silence, tears streaming down her face. The noise of the restaurant faded into the background. She thought about her mother, who had suffered quietly all these years. Now she could finally breathe, finally take care of herself in her dreams. She thought about the little boy, whose laughter had been a balm to her own tired heart. And she thought about the man sitting across from her, a stranger who had chosen to honor her in a way she'd never imagined. Finally, she managed a shaky laugh, half disbelief, half joy. I don't even know how to begin to thank you. She said. You don't need to, he replied. Just keep being who you are. That's more than enough. That evening, after her shift ended, she stood in the quiet of her new apartment, the keys warm in her hands. The furniture gleamed softly in the evening light, and the burdens she had carried for so long seemed almost unreal in their absence. For the first time in years, she felt free. She could breathe without the constant weight of debt and worry pressing down on her chest. She could imagine a future not consumed by survival, but by possibility. A few days later, she visited the little boy again, not as a waitress serving food, but as a friend who had become part of their lives. The boy ran to her, arms open wide, laughing without hesitation. The father watched quietly from behind, a satisfied smile on his face. In her hands, she carried small gifts. She had made herself folded napkins, little toys, and handmade drawings. Nothing extravagant, but to the boy, they were treasures. As they sat together, sharing stories and laughter, the father realized that life had a way of balancing itself. His son had been given joy and attention that money alone could never provide, and in return, the young woman had been given an opportunity to live the life she deserved. It was a circle of kindness, humility, and gratitude that had begun in a small restaurant. With a simple gesture of wiping away a tear, in the days and weeks that followed, the waitress settled into her new apartment, enrolled in her course, and finally found time for herself. She spent more moments laughing with her mother, pursuing dreams she had postponed for years, and embracing the freedom that had seemed impossible before. And throughout it all, the bond with the boy and his father grew stronger, a reminder that small acts of kindness can ripple outward, changing lives in ways no one can predict. Every time the father looked at his son's laughter, he remembered that night in the restaurant. He remembered the way a stranger had knelt to care for his child, a moment so simple, yet so profound, that it altered the course of their lives forever. And as for the young woman, she carried with her the knowledge that her heart, her care, and her compassion had created a life-changing impact, not through wealth, but through the power of human kindness. From that day forward, the restaurant, the small city streets, and even the quiet moments in their homes held a new significance. A simple act of noticing, a gentle gesture of care, and a willingness to see someone beyond their struggles had started a chain of events that no one would forget. It was a story of hope, proof that genuine human kindness can transform lives, and that sometimes the smallest actions can leave the biggest mark. And so, life went on changed forever by a waitress who wiped a tear, a little boy who smiled, and a father who saw the true value of a compassionate heart.